Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Meena Dayak, and I'm the Executive Vice President at Open Minds. It is my pleasure today to introduce my colleague, Joe Naughton-Travers, who will be talking to you about strategic planning for post-disruption recovery and sustainability. So before I hand it off to Joe to give us tons and tons of wisdom and great ideas, I just want to tell you a little bit about him. I know that most of you on the call know Joe really well, and he needs no introduction. But for those who are meeting Joe for the first time, he has more than 30 years of experience in the health and human services field and has been a senior associate with Open Minds, leading many, many client initiatives. And Joe started off his career as a behavioral health clinician working both in child welfare and in community mental health clinic settings. And after that, he held a senior business operations management position for a psychiatric hospital system and its community mental health clinics. And after that, he was vice president for a firm specializing in information systems, billing, receivables management for community-based mental health programs. So Joe really has been across the spectrum in the specialty health and human services sector, and he has brought all of his expertise to bear for Open Minds. And I'm not saying this just because he's my colleague, but really he is one of the most sought after consultants in the nation on all things related to strategic planning. So this is your opportunity. You have the best of the best with Joe, and he's going to walk us through a strategic planning framework for both planning as well as implementation. And after that, it really is your time. We do these weekly briefings for our elite members, so you have a chance to get some technical assistance, if I can call it that. But Joe will be on the line for as long as it takes to answer every one of your questions. We would love for you to share your experiences with strategic planning and to really ask all your questions. You won't be able to talk right now while Joe's presenting, but there's a question box on the right of your screen. So just throw your question in there, send me a quick chat, and I will either ask Joe your question, or preferably we'd love for you after the presentation to come on camera, or at least to turn your audio on and speak. So if you shoot me a quick note, I will unmute you at the end after Joe's presentation, and we'll bring you in so we can have a good conversation. And so I would say take advantage of this time with Joe and get all your questions answered. So with that, I also will remind you that we are recording this session, and a recording and Joe's fabulous slide deck will both be available to you. We will get those on the Open Minds website likely by tomorrow morning and send you all an email. So thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to all talk to our elite members at any time. We love having this opportunity with you. And with that, Joe, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Meena, for the kind introduction. So team members, elite members, I know I can see actually I have a number of colleagues and customers in the background here. It's great to be with you today. As I was preparing this presentation, I was talking to, of course, my colleague Monica last week as we planned this. So for those of you who have been attending the Blueprint for Crisis Recovery, a lot of the sessions that Monica and I and my great colleagues have been doing have been really about crisis management. How do we deal with the pandemic? And in the last 4 months, you guys have done amazing things on that front. So this next section of our blueprint is really about looking towards the future. So my presentation today is really just the introduction to the high-level notion of strategic planning for post-pandemic. I have lots of colleagues. I think we have, Meena, I think we have like 15 or so sessions as part of this blueprint, which are about the details of doing that. But so I'm going to lead you through it, and some of you have, done this with me before. I'm proud to be working on strategic planning initiatives in Kentucky and Texas and Ohio right now. We've really updated our notion of strategic planning because we really need to be focusing on the post-pandemic issues. So again, just a reminder, go to the chat box or questions. And so we have a chance to chat about that, but I'm going to move forward through my slides here as we do this together. So when I put this presentation together, I wanted to talk a bit about the big picture, what is going on, to describe our four-phase model of strategic planning, and that's actually planning and implementation. And then Monica and I found an interesting article, actually it was written a long time ago, about scenario-based planning that fits in with the model that we've often used at Open Minds, which is if you don't know what the future is going to look like a year from now, you should plan for more than one future. So that's the broad notion of scenario-based planning. For item 4 here, I have tons and tons of slides. What I've pulled together is an array of data that we've used for folks that we're doing planning with. And then I'll try to wrap that up in section 5 about how to do the synthesis of all that and then do the plan development. So again, if you have questions or comments, put them in the little side box on the right there. Remember, you'll get the PowerPoint slides later. So let me go ahead and move through. So, I think you're all familiar with strategic planning. In the old days, 20 years ago, when I first worked with folks, we did strategic planning for 10 years. It was here's who we're going to be. It was more vision statements, and people wrote a plan and put it on the bookshelf. It doesn't work that way anymore. And in particular, in this time period, strategic planning might need to be even shorter term in terms of how we figure out what's going on in the marketplace and how we move forward. So as my colleague Monica talks about, we need to be planning for today. That's the current market. We're all still mostly in lockdown at this point. We're doing most of our services virtually. How do we make that work? And you guys have been doing that for 4 months now. And then, what is the future going to look like? Well, I personally don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I think by July of next year, we should be back to something different than now. But, the question for us in our service lines as providers is, what will that be? Will we still operate day programs because they've been closed down forever? Will we continue to do telehealth for almost everyone we serve or a fraction of the population? So our notion today is really about planning for the future. And then the last part here on my slide is how do we get from here to there? So I do like to focus on, I've been talking about strategic planning for a while at Open Minds, but the world is so different now. Reopening is not recovery. Monica wrote about this a few weeks back. We've been doing this rolling reopening of our country across the nation. It goes back and forth, and it depends on where you live. But that's not recovery. That's just a store opening up again. It is not what the post-pandemic world will look like. It's just what we're doing now. And again, there's been a lot of variability in how we're doing that from region to region. I think my second bullet point here is this is where I really count on our CEOs in particular and their leadership teams. The things you guys have been doing the last 4 months about both adapting to the crisis, planning for the future, doing appropriate downsizing, keeping staff and consumers safe is enormous. I'm so glad I'm not a CEO. But it's about this adaptability. And one of the things I was talking to a colleague last week about is we're also beginning to understand which of our leadership team is uncomfortable with uncertainty. The fact we don't know exactly what the world's going to look like in 6 months or 12 months. We're beginning to understand there's those of us who do better with uncertainty, and there's those of us who are more uncomfortable with it. I do believe, and the last 2 bullet points are my editorial opinion, I believe that the virtual notion is going to be the new normal, both from an administrative side and from a clinical side. So from a strategy standpoint, I'm talking to customers about, okay, you're doing telehealth with everyone now, but who best benefits from it? Who would go back to face-to-face care? How would we blend that care going forward? And from an office standpoint, do we need our billing staff to be in the office if they've been able to do all their finance work from their homes? What administrative offices, functions can continue to be virtual versus in office. So part of that's part of the planning that we're all doing together. My last bullet point here, Monica and I actually disagree on the number. I've been conservative here from my perspective. I think that 20 or 25% of provider organizations are not likely to be around by July of next year. Monica thinks the number may be higher. We'll see who's right. But the broad notion is that this pandemic has had an enormous financial impact on healthcare providers. And I note here, cash and credit are particularly important to survival. It's not even bottom line. So what that's doing from a strategy standpoint is if we're one of those organizations that's struggling, we're trying to figure out what to do. If we're one of those organizations that it has a little more financial comfort, we're expecting the market to change. So I'm seeing a lot more M&A activity. I'm seeing people take over service delivery in other areas. So the difference between strategic planning this year versus last year is this pandemic has had an enormous impact in all sorts of ways. So again, let me go back to my basic slides about strategic planning. The reason we do strategic planning is it helps us translate our mission, come up with a plan for high-level priorities. We focus the organization on it. It gives clarity to the board, the leadership team, and then we can build our budgets and our operational plans based on all of those things. On this slide, this is my sort of cheat list of things that often come up as strategic options. So again, they may not apply to you or they may apply to you, but some of the things that we found that come up very commonly are, should we consider closing a service line? Are there service lines that we need to improve the financial performance on? Can we change a service line of the value added notion to make it more attractive to payers and consumers? Can we expand? Can we take over the world geographically? Can we serve new customers? Most strategic plans do include the diversification of revenue notion, which is, can we get other payers to pay for it? Do we step up the ladder and do more value-based purchasing, move to alternative payment models, so that we're at a different place in the value chain? We're just not a commodity anymore. And then the last one on this slide has to really do with size. Do we need to be a different size to be able to operate in the market? Do we need to look at partnerships, mergers, acquisitions? So these are things that commonly come up during any strategic planning process for us. There are all sorts of things that we can do. All sorts of things we can do wrong when it comes to implementing a plan. We don't have the right folks involved. We're not handling the detailed business ops things. There are all sorts of things we can do with a failing an implementation plan. But today I'd really like to focus on the process of developing the plan. I have another component in this blueprint we're doing in August, which is more about the details of implementation. So together, let's talk about the 4-phase model that Open Minds has for strategic planning. So the first part is really pulling together the data, understanding who we are, what's happening internally and externally to our organization, and pulling it all together. I'll be giving you lots of examples of this. That is the data collection piece. From my perspective, we're just gathering all sorts of information. And again, I have lots of examples of that. And then we do the synthesis or the analysis of that, and we come up with the high-level objectives, And then we detail, tactics, initiatives, timelines, etc. So those are the first two pieces. I actually consider those the planning parts. And then we get to the budgeting and implementation phases. And I'll be talking more about this in August in my second presentation. The first part of phase 3 is really just, we built a plan now, but where do the numbers work out? What are the detailed implementation tactics? How do we need to adjust the strategy based on budgets? And then how do we actually implement the plan? Monica and I talk a lot about performance indicators. How do we, go forward with a metrics-based strategy to ensure that we're hitting key timelines and being successful in the long run. So I'm going to revisit those just for a moment for you. Phase 1 is the data collection, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a moment. Phase 2 is the analysis, synthesis, and coming up with high-level objectives. This, just for you all to know, this is a 6-hour meeting. This is not months. We have all the data, we pull it together, we look at it, and we figure out where are we going from here. When we get to the feasibility and the implementation, that's much more complicated, making the budgets work, the ops plans, having performance indicators, etc. So, all right, on this slide, we summarize, and many of you may have seen this before, the best practice process for strategic planning with all its components here. And what I've labeled on the right side here are the various phases. So the first phase is what I'm talking mostly about today, which is, what's our market positioning? Let's do the internal and external analysis. Let's look at the potential scenarios of the market looking forward, and let's come up with high-level objectives. From there, we move down to, budgets, performance indicators, and other sorts of things that can include, developing new service lines, collaborating with partners, other sorts of things. So one of the things, I'm going to jump ahead here, that Monica and I have been talking about for decades now is, I often have folks that say, oh, well, we can't plan for 2 years from now because we don't know what the market's going to look like. Our market is considering privatizing Medicaid, or we're in the middle of a pandemic and we don't know what service delivery is going to look like. So what we always talk about is scenario-based planning, where we pick possible futures and we make sure we plan for all of them. The market may look like this in 2 years, or it may look like that. What's interesting for me, having done this so many times, is that 75% of what we do that's part of our strategic plans is likely to be the same in more than one scenario. Now, what's different now is we're in this time of greater uncertainty because of the pandemic. We're all wondering when can we go from virtual? When can our staff come back? What services will still be paid for? Will Kentucky still be paying for day services because they're cutting their budget? Will Texas be doing this or that? There was an article that was written, actually, this was in the late 90s by Harvard Business Review, that talks about developing strategy under uncertainty. And I like this in particular because it expands on our notion of scenario-based planning. So level 1 is when we absolutely know what's going to happen next, which is not the case now. But it's the future is clear. We just build a plan. The reality in today's world is that most people's planning falls into levels 2 or 3. Either we can define a short list of scenarios, 2 or 3, or it might be a little bit broader. But we have some sense of where things are going. We just don't know what it's going to be. And so when we're doing planning, we need to plan for multiple scenarios. What's interesting for me now, and I've run into this with a number of my customers, is everyone thinks we're at level 4. True ambiguity. I don't know what the heck the world's going to look like next year, so how can I plan? I would argue, just like the authors of this article did, that we don't give up and just, make decisions on gut instinct. We need to build an array of possible futures and plan for the most likely ones. And then perhaps there's metrics we put into place to determine, oh, it seems like scenario C is more likely to happen than scenario B. So I really did like this article that, again, was written in the late 90s about scenario-based planning. So let's dive into it together as a group here. I know some of you are with me live and some of you are doing this afterwards. I really do like to show people the kind of data we put together in phase one. And this is not rocket science, you know, it's just pulling together the data that then we use for phase two, which is the synthesis and the analysis part. So when I'm commonly talking to folks about strategic planning, we talk about two things, external data and internal data. So I have a lot of slides here where we're giving examples of data we've pulled together for folks. So typically when we're doing the external analysis, we always do the national trends, what's happening on a national level, what's happening on a local level, the state and local trends. I do encourage people to at least profile competitors and potential partners. And some of the rest of this changes a little bit. We have to understand our payers. Sometimes we do qualitative interviews. I'll explain that more. We do focus groups. So let me give you some examples. And again, this is over a decade of work of pulling together information. So today, and again, I just did 3 strategic planning sessions in the last month. You know, we talk about what's happening on a national level. So here's a short example without detailed slides. We have the pandemic. We have the expansion of managed care models across all payers. We have the shift to value-based purchasing for services. We have the movement towards integration with primary care. We have the whole competition and consolidation of providers. That's the M&A activity. And then we have all the technology things that are happening. So this is just an example. Normally I have a lot more slides where we explain to the board and executive team the details of these things. But then I always like to look at what's happening at a local level. So, you know, I have a wonderful Texas provider that gave examples of what's happening in their local market. There are some issues with their waiver, provider shortage, you know, other sorts of service demand needs. And I have another example here from New Jersey from a few years ago about the key things that were going on there. So the whole point of this is you're trying to look outside the agency and understand what's happening in the big picture and the local picture, because it affects how we do our planning organizationally. So additionally, from part of the external analysis, we like to look at competitors. Now this one is about 3 or 4 years old. I actually use the word competitors/collaborators now because they may be people we partner with. But, you know, in this case, a Massachusetts customer pulled together basic information about other providers, how big they were, and sort of what their branding assessment was. This is a more spreadsheet kind of thing a provider did that was basically trying to pull together detailed information about competitors in their local marketplaces. An example from Ohio of them listing the folks that they pulled in more detailed information, and another example from Texas. But what we're trying to do is to look outside the organization and see who's delivering services like us, who's competing for our consumers, who's competing for our contracts, who might be a partner. And again, this slide is probably harder to see. Then the other piece of the external analysis is what's going on in the payer market. Who are the major payers? How many covered lives do they have? Where are they located? Again, this was part of a very deep spreadsheet that we pulled together. So again, the big picture of the external analysis is trends and competitors, but sometimes it's helpful to do a little bit more. So I have examples here of where we've done qualitative interviews, you know, where you call up folks. You know, I've had engagements where I've been asked to call 10 major leaders in a marketplace and ask them about their overall experience with the provider, customer service, service needs. They might be payers, they might be government agencies or other sorts of things. Or we could do focus groups for those sorts of things. So qualitative interviews, again, these are not surveys. This is where you're really, you're picking a group of folks. It does help to have an outside person do this rather than a staff member. But you ask them questions about the brand image, competitors, service demand. Are we changing payment models? Are there service needs that are different? Because it can help us with our planning process. Similarly, and this is more likely to be with payers and referral sources, you could invite people to attend a focus group where you basically ask the same sorts of questions. What's their experience been with the agency? Is it easy to get into care? Are there services that are in need? How do they think about us? Was it easy? Those sorts of things. But again, it's all about gathering data from outside our organization so we can do our planning process together. When we move to the internal analysis, the data set is a little bit smaller. We have to look at a lot of math things. So I'll show you lots of slides that are about pie chart mixes of revenue mix by payer, service line, and even if we're not for profit, we need to look at profit and loss by service line and other sorts of things. But it is also helpful from an engagement standpoint to get feedback from our staff, from our board, our executive team. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So the notion here is we just want people's input about what are we doing well, what are we not doing well, what are our opportunities. So let me show you a whole bunch of slides. This is from an array of engagements. I do always like to look at revenue by payer, broadly speaking. So for this particular customer, you can see that they were almost exclusively public funded. Nearly 70% is state and county funding, and almost 25% was Medicaid. They had a small payer mix. So part of what you're doing when you're looking at payer mix is just saying, oh, should it be different? Should we add more private pay? Should we add, as you can see here with this particular customer, should we add more commercial insurance mix? And then the other thing you're thinking about is if the rules about any of these payers is changing, if the state's moving away from contract funding and to fee for service, and it's 70% of your budget, that's a big deal. Again, you don't need to have a pie chart with lots of slices if you know that the funding is still going to come in and the rules aren't changing. But it's part of the reason we look at program revenue by payer. And I have a couple other examples here. In this particular case, again, a very large mix of public funding. This was a Virginia customer a number of years ago. Again, the largest portion was state funding and Medicaid, but they had a few other pie slices. And then in addition to that, and this is a nice pie chart, I do like to look at revenue by service line. How much are we doing behavioral health versus IDD versus other services? So for this particular pie chart, it was the way they define their services, but a third is behavioral health, and they have some other services here. It just helps you to understand, particularly if the demand for particular services is changing, where our dollars are coming from. And the other question one asks when looking at revenue mix by service line is there another pie piece that should be here? Should we have primary care? Should we have other services that are not part of our current pie chart? So again, a different customer here showing the mix of revenue by programs over several years. In this case, it's a chart changes over time for particular service lines over time. So you can see, for instance, here their diversion services have increased significantly over time. There's been this weird change with the district stuff, which had more to do with funding. But using these graphical displays of data can be really helpful to initiate that discussion, the synthesis that I've talked about when we're looking at our planning. So I know a lot of us are not for profit, but dollars matter because we have to pay our bills. So I always look at profit and loss. This is a very simple slide. Are we losing money or making money? The bad news is we were losing in 2017, and we got better. But then you go from there to actually looking at profit and loss from a service line standpoint. So again, this is an example from a customer in New Jersey. I've de-identified it. Where are we making money? Oops, sorry. I didn't mean to change that. Where are we making money and where are we losing money? The other thing I always tell folks to pay attention to is what the margin is. If we have a 40% positive margin on shared living services, like I have on this slide, it's an IDD services. Again, it's only a small part of our revenue for this particular agency. You can see it's, sorry, I should not be clicking. It's only $564,000 of their total revenue, so it's not a giant piece. But if you're looking at expanding services, that would be the one you'd want to do. If you look down the page here, their employment services are operating at a significant loss of 21%. So again, it just helps us to take a look at where we're making money, where we're losing money, and when we're making decisions about moving forward. So I will click again now and show you some other examples. This is an agency where, and I put it in red because they had major losses in some of their service lines. So that was the strategic challenge they were looking at. And then lastly, if we're trying to get internal information aside from the numbers, we can solicit feedback from team members. So here's just an example. I have 2 slides here of doing a SWOT analysis of an anonymous survey about folks giving us feedback about the organization, and they're summarized here. So what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities? And what are the threats to us in the marketplace? So I've covered a lot there. The basic notion is scenario-based planning, which is we look for alternative futures and figure out which ones are most likely to happen. We pull together the data. That's all those slides I just showed you. And my experience is that's not really hard. There's the external data, the internal data. If we're doing focus groups or SWOT surveys, that takes a little bit longer, but most of the rest of it is pretty straightforward. So phase 2 of the open mind strategic planning process is then we have to do something with that. And so the most important part now is if we looked at all that data together, if we looked at those slides together in a planning session, what does it mean? I call this the elevator speech. If you had to tell people the 5 things it meant, we're in a good financial position, the pandemic is having an impact on this, we have a staff problem, we need better data for quality outcome, whatever it is, we should be able to summarize all of that internal and external data into a short bullet list. It's less than 10, hopefully closer to 5, of what does all that mean? And I always think of board members in particular when I'm thinking of this, which is we show them all this stuff and we want to be able to say, oh, we do have a great brand image in the marketplace. Our financials are okay, but they're sort of break even. There's really a demand for integration with primary care and more quality outcomes. And we really have a problem with working with these sets of consumers because there's not enough capacity. It's some sort of synthesis of all that stuff together. So what are the key findings and how is the landscape impacting us in terms of how we move forward with that? So if you do number 1, actually number 2 literally usually falls out of it. So if you have 5 key findings, you often have 5 high-level objectives. They're really the big picture items about what we need to accomplish. They're not they're not yearly operational goals, or, it's not about, implementing a new EHR. It's not at that level. It's about, we're going to grow from here to there. We're going to do primary care integration for all our consumers. So these are really high level objectives. Typically 3 to 5. I've rarely seen more than that. So it's the big picture items that we're working on. So that actually is phase 1 and phase 2 of the Open Minds plan. Number 3 here is the detailed stuff. And this is where it's easier for folks to dive in, which is, okay, these are our objectives. What are the 10 things we need to do, or the 20 things we need to do to make that happen? Where's the budget that goes with that? Oh, the budget's expensive. Do we need to modify our tactics and timelines? This is the ops piece of really fleshing out the details of how you're going to make number 2 happen. And then very importantly, number 4 is, okay, this is a 2-year initiative, a 3-year initiative. How do we measure success? Some of them may be process metrics, some of them may be metrics directly related to the objectives, but how do we make sure that we have performance indicators that we can use on a daily or monthly basis to make sure that we're actually making progress on the implementation plan and or actually accomplishing the particular objectives. So I'm going to just show you a couple examples from other engagements here, and then we're really going to open it up to conversation. So, again, this is just an example. Oh, and I'm misnumbered here. I apologize for that. Doing some strategic analysis where we were trying to pull together everything. I just wanted to show you an example of, if you look at all the internal and external data, what does it mean? What's the elevator speech for the board? In this particular case, there's the pandemic and the financial impact. Number 2, and again, I apologize for being misnumbered here. They have a great reputation for service excellence. Number 3, they're in a strong financial position. Number 4, demand really from the marketplace for quality data. And number 5 really had to do with the whole integration of care. So again, the whole notion here is you're trying to take all that information and synthesize it so that people can understand it. So from there, this particular organization set some high-level objectives, and again, you'll see the slides afterwards. One had to do with service excellence, one had to do with family-centered holistic care, which is integration. One had to do with being the visionary advocate and community partner and collaborating with other folks. And one high-level objective had to do with service expansion. All of these are being detailed in all sorts of ways with all sorts of initiatives after that. Another example here of sort of synthesizing the internal and external data, are 4 key findings for a different organization. Again, number 1, they had a really strong local recognized brand reputation for working with folks that were very complicated. Number 2, they were financially stable, but really operated at a slim margin. Number 3, they had major HR issues because they were an IDD provider, and had a lot of difficulty maintaining direct care staff. And number 4 had to do with the size of the organization. They really felt like they needed to be larger in order to invest in, infrastructure, IT systems, and other sorts of things. And from that, they came up with some high-level objectives too. Again, just examples here. They again wanted to be a premier provider. They wanted to diversify revenue streams. They really wanted to work on the HR stuff and be seen as an employer of choice so that they could get folks to want to work for them. And they had a whole lot of administrative infrastructure stuff they needed to work on. My last couple slides before I open up here is you then take that real high level picture. Some of those may have been really broad for you all, but it is where I tend to go with things. And then you build a detailed plan. You build what are the initiatives that we need to do to make each of these happen. So again, in this slide, I'm just giving a detail of, about 6 initiatives that were related to an objective, and the columns here were related to particular time periods. Do we do it in the next 6 months or the next 12 months, and how do we move it forward? From there, you also pick performance metrics. So I have a very simple example here of some key performance indicators a Philadelphia customer picked for a couple of their high-level objectives. One of their high-level objectives was to, really define themselves as a center of excellence, and they had picked three metrics here. And then they were wrestling with lots of HR issues, so they had a number of metrics here. So what I'd like to do, Mina, is really let's just open this up. I have to open up my GoToMeeting thing here to other team members, because I've been talking for 40 minutes here. Attendees, what are your thoughts? What questions do you have? The process, I hope, is pretty straightforward. You'll get the slides for that.
Joe, thank you. Thank you for walking us through that framework. It was really helpful. Some questions are coming in more on the chat as opposed to, I haven't seen anyone say that they're ready to have their microphones or cameras turned on yet. So while they are working that out, I would invite people to just click on the little hand icon. If you raise your hand, I'll know you want to speak. Or if you want to type something into the chat box, I'm happy to ask Joe for you. So Joe, Delia has a question, and she says, throughout I was surprised that you're talking about strategic planning, but you did not refer to the mission, vision, values. And Delia says that every process that she has seen with a nonprofit starts off with the discussion of mission and vision, which is a lot of semantics, but where does all that lead, and why did you not address it? You sort of went straight into objectives and landscape assessment.
Well, Delia, you are right. I did not cover that in my slides, because normally what we do is we start the planning session by revisiting our mission and our vision, saying, here's who we want to be, here's our plan, and then we dive into, and again, I apologize, I was so focused on the analysis part, but you're absolutely right, and it doesn't matter whether we're for-profit or not-for-profit. The decisions we make during the planning process have to be in the context of our vision and mission. Now, that said, sometimes we tweak the vision and mission a little bit during the planning process. Maybe an organization begins to say, oh, we're going to provide whole person care, or we're going to provide care for adults as well as kids. So now, Delia, you're absolutely right. I did miss that in my slides, but it's the starting point, which is who are we, what's our vision and mission, and then we go into the details. So Mina, she caught me.
She did, but I have a follow-up question to that, Joe. We, as you mentioned, are now thinking especially about strategic planning in the context of the pandemic, the crisis, the total market disruption that it's caused. But how often does that scenario might have a few different implications, but how often do you have to change these things? How flexible do you have to be? How long is your strategic plan valid? And how often should you talk about your mission and vision? You can't revisit it every few months.
Well, another difficult question. Thank you, Mina. Typically, when at Open Minds, when we're working with organizations, the 2 or 3 year objectives often don't change. We're going to focus on being a great provider. We're going to do more integration with primary care. We're going to expand our marketplace, whatever that it is. It is actually the initiatives or tactics that change more often. Now, that said, when the whole market shifts, like this happened to us in February, the pandemic hit, then people need to regroup entirely. But in normal circumstances, which I'm hoping we'll get back to, it's only the initiatives or tactics that change, but the big picture, where we're going, where we're trying to be, doesn't typically change, is my experience. Now, and part of what my colleague Monica talks a lot about, and the place we're trying to get providers to, is strategic management, that it's an ongoing process. It's not a formal, every 3 years we do this thing. that we have a regular way where we're incorporating data, we're adjusting our plans and moving forward.
Thanks, Joe. So some people who may or may not be on the call today had sent questions ahead of time. So if we can answer them, we take a few of those. We probably can get back to them later. Can you talk a little bit more about, you did go over this, but how long does the whole process take from start to finish? Because people are wondering how they can actually make the time for strategic planning in a crisis mode like we sort of still are in.
Sure. Well, my experience with the data analysis, that's the phase one stuff, the external, internal data. I mean, that's a month or two at the most. Now, if we're doing focus groups or if we're doing interviews, sometimes, there's scheduling issues, but pulling together the financial portfolio and pretty pie charts, doing a staff survey via SurveyMonkey, identifying the key trends in the marketplace, that's not rocket science for most of us. I mean, we know what they are. So I seriously think 1 to 2 months. If we're doing focus groups or interviews, it stretches out a little bit. The planning session itself is 5 to 6 hours. I swear to God, it's, you put the right people together, and to our colleagues' point, you start with a mission and vision. You look at the data. Here's what's happening outside. Here's what's happening inside. What does this mean? And you often come up with the high-level objectives in a short period of time. Now, from there, phase 3 and 4 of our Open Minds process, we'll talk more about next month. Doing the budgeting, the detailed planning, the implementation planning, all those sorts of things. That does take more time. But from a big picture, I would say 2 to 3 months at the most, if we're focused.
Yeah, and Marie has just sent another question in, Joe. You talked about the fact that most of the people here today are nonprofits, and but that we still need to look at our bottom line. Can you talk a little bit more about the balance between margin and mission? What if we have programs, for example, that are not producing the kind of margins that would make them viable, but that if they are vital to our mission, where is that balance? What do we do?
Well, so my initial response to your question, Nina, and our colleagues, is think about it as our family checkbook. We have to make sure there's enough money in there to pay the bills. And we all balance our budgets. And we never tell people, oh, everything needs to make money, but the math has to work. And so the mission margin balance is really about, okay, if we know this service line is going to operate at a 2% loss, but it's important to us and we can't make it better than that, then where are we getting the money? Is it our other service line is operating profitably? Are we getting charitable funds for it? Are we getting grants? I have a wonderful provider in Michigan where they actually use their endowment to help underwrite one of their major service lines. They know it operates at a loss, but they are determined to keep doing it. So, my example, again, is the family checkbook. We still have to pay the bills. So we have to make decisions, are we doing Netflix? Are we buying groceries? Are we doing other sorts of things? So we don't have to have everything make a profit if that's our mission, but we still have to figure out how to make the math work. One of my favorite slides, and I didn't have it for today's presentation, has to do with that mission profitability matrix. It's a very common one that's used in the industry. I think it was originally by GE, where you plot your service lines on a quadrant of 4 based on how core are they to our mission and do they make a profit? Because what you want to do is make sure the things that are profitable are paying for the things that are core to your mission that aren't.
Great, thanks, Joe. I think on a related note, well, maybe the connection's only in my mind, but Susan has a good question about board involvement. When do you start involving your board in the strategic planning process? And Susan also wants to know, in the 1 to 2 month time frame that you talked about for completing strategic planning, does that include the process of getting that board buy-in? When do you want to bring them in?
Sure, actually, and thanks, Susan, for the question. The board involvement really varies a lot from engagement to engagement, and this is really based on what CEOs do. Some CEOs work very closely with their boards, and they want the board actually part of the process. So my wonderful El Paso customer, their board is actually part of the planning process. Other organizations use the planning process, and then the CEO presents the strategic plan to the board for approval. So neither one is right or wrong. It just has to do with the relationship between the CEO and the board. I've most often seen the planning, and I like to make a big distinction between governance, which is what the board is supposed to do, and management, which is what the CEO and her team is supposed to do. I actually prefer a model where it's primarily the CEO and her team. There may be a board member or two that's invited to the process, but then it's it's the CEO that comes up with the plan and presents it to the board. But again, that really varies based on individual boards. But that's my preferred model, because I do like to make a big distinction between the governance role of a board and the ops role of a CEO and her team.
Yeah, and Joe, as a follow-up to what Susan said, I've heard that some people have trouble letting go of programs where the math doesn't work, as you said, because it could be a board member, it could be long-time leadership, but usually on the part of the board, sort of this worry about the mission and, are we losing out because we are planning this alternative route, or, we want to revisit our program portfolio. And what would you say is the best way to really get that buy-in on your strategic plan and the priorities you've identified?
Oh, that's a hard one, Susan and Mina. One of the things I see most often is people unwilling to let go of a program that's losing money, or they don't have good market share, or there's no demand for it in the marketplace. But, it's been here for 133 years, or, it was the CEO's idea, or we really care about this particular program. It's the reason the planning process is strategic, which is, we make decisions about what we're going to invest in, what we're not going to invest in. How do we survive the future? And for some not-for-profits I've worked with, it's been a little easier letting go of the service line if they know someone else in the marketplace is doing it. The kid service provider that did foster care, but they only had a few homes, and they lose money at it and all sorts of things. We're like, well, it doesn't make sense for you to do that from a budget standpoint. You're not a major player, but you can partner with the folks down the street and let them do the foster care. So I had a gig a number of years ago, Mina. I can't even say what city it was in. We were doing this portfolio mission profitability thing that I talked about, the Hollywood squares about what makes money and doesn't make money. And they had a lot of things that were in the mission focused but lose money Hollywood square. And I said, so what do we do about this? And the CEO, she said to me, don't make me choose amongst my children. But I do think it illustrates that challenge of letting go of a service line that isn't working and making a different decision. I find that one to be the hardest for folks. It's easier to get people to add service lines than it is to subtract.
I fully expect you to break into song now, Joe, and sing this Frozen song, Let It Go. So next time, please be prepared. We'll put you on the spot. Which leads me to, Joe, answer this question without bias. Somebody sent it in earlier, question 4 that you see on the screen. Can you, there's lots of frameworks, ideas out there. So can somebody take a framework like what you've presented today and really handle strategic planning internally? What value does an external consultant bring to the, equation, or if you can't afford a consultant, what is the best way to do that planning process yourself?
Well, of course, you always need open minds, but beside that,
No, no bias.
no, actually, the trick, I think, it does really help to have someone facilitate at least the planning day. When you're putting the data together. Now, you could have a new staff person, you could have a board member that does that, you could use a consultant like Open Minds or other people. I do think it really helps to have, you certainly don't want your planning session to be led by the CEO, her leadership team, or any of the folks, because what you're trying to do is to get folks to really be engaged and be open, and to be open to all sorts of possibilities. So some of you may have board members who could do this for you, or some of you may have hired a new staff person who's not quite as entangled in the organization who could do this for you. Or some of you may just decide, and again, we do this at Open Minds, obviously, you might just bring in someone for the facilitation session. So I do believe you want someone, who's running it, who's a little more distant from the whole leadership team, but I think there's lots of options there.
Great, thank you, Joe. I will pass that on to the person that sent the question in. And then can you talk about what is the best way to communicate your strategic plan? Do you have any tips? And we have so many groups of stakeholders, right? Staff, starting with your internal staff to, we talked about the board, but all other external stakeholders. What should you communicate? What really is relevant? What should you put up on your website?
Sure. So if we've done this process well, remember I talked about SWOT surveys, community focus groups, we've already engaged key stakeholders in the process. So they've been part of the process. So certainly we would want to communicate at least the high level objectives. Here's what we came up with. You communicate that. Now, you don't always communicate the detailed initiatives, because maybe our initiatives are about merging or acquiring folks. So you don't want that to be, you don't always want the detailed planning to be part of it. But I'm used to, formally presenting the plan to the board for their approval. I'm used to folks putting on their website their high level objectives. I'm used to folks taking those objectives and the performance indicators and things we'll talk about in our August seminar and making those part of our internal meetings. Here's where we're going, here's what we found, here's the feedback you gave us, here's the performance metrics, here's where we are 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line. And I don't know if I talked about it in particular, when we talk about stakeholders, oftentimes those may include consumer and advocate groups as stakeholders. So it's also communicating those high level objectives to them. I don't normally advocate sending all the details to everyone. It's just more, here's our 5 objectives for the next 3 years, and here's what we're doing, here's what our performance is. Now, reporting the accomplishments is really helpful. So if we have good performance indicators, we can really use those organizationally to, celebrate our success externally as well as internally as we move forward.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So I'm not seeing more questions come in from our elite members here. Again, want to thank you for joining us. But Joe, before we wrap up, put your consultant hat back on. I like the hat you're wearing, by the way, whatever hat that is, whichever hat that is. And tell us, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I wanted to say 3 things, but it can be 5 things. It can be 2 things. Based on all the client engagements you've done for strategic planning, what are the major traps? What should you really try to avoid?
Oh, traps?
Yeah, what are the problems or the biggest challenges you can run into during the strategic planning process, and how can you avoid them?
Well, I think I would label one, just one actually. I think my experience has been that people don't look outside their organization. Actually, I'm going to do 2. They don't look outside their organization enough. What are the trends? Who are the competitors? What's really happening? I mean, I've done engagements where people didn't even know their brand image was not well respected. They just thought they were great, but they never asked anyone, you know. And when we did some, interviewing, we found out, well, not everyone thinks you're great. So I think, one mistake to make is not being market focused. And then the second one is not doing enough of the math about profitability in particular. We may be not for profit, but we still need to balance the checkbook. So I would label it those two, which is not doing enough external research, and the second is not paying enough attention to the math. A lot of times what people do is they talk about service lines they care about and the consumers they serve and all sorts of things, and that's wonderful, but we can't do that mission unless the math works. So.
Thank you, Joe. That was a very succinct summary, and really appreciate your taking the time to consult here with our elite members today. Appreciate you leading us through the process. I invite all of you back, and I look forward to Joe's part 2 session, which is on August 20th. It'll be here before we know it, and where he is going to get more into the implementation details of strategy. And we have something going on for you every week, so do check back in, check our website, and do participate in all of our web briefings. We're here every Thursday at 1 Eastern, and we'd love to have you participate and take advantage of your elite membership. So Joe, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. And for folks in the circle, if you want to connect to any of us personally, just let Nina know. Be glad to chat with folks. So hopefully you found it helpful. Hopefully everyone's doing well. And Nina, thanks for moderating for us today.
Sure. And on that note, our email is openminds@openminds.com. Just feel free to email us at any time, and we will get back to you right away. Thanks, Joe. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
All right. Be well, everyone.